Hello, my name is Amanda Skalka, and this is my presentation on the exotic pet trade. Now, when talking about the exotic pet trade, there's two different sides to it. There's the side which is focused on breeding, and then there's a side focused on animal trafficking, which is taking animals from their natural environment and then selling them elsewhere as pets. Breeding is usually legally done and doesn't really affect wild populations unless animals are released back into the wild. Disease transfer is usually limited. It's usually done much more ethically as the breeders have a lot more investment in the care and well-being of the animals, though not all the time. It's usually sustainable and creates a captive population that we can draw from, although usually captive bred animals aren't really good enough to be released back into the wild. It still has plenty of its own issues, like selling to ignorant individuals, captive animals, not always being in the best situations, etc., etc., etc. But animal trafficking, on the other hand, has a lot more issues. It's not always illegal to do, but it's the main way of selling animals within the illegal pet trade. Removing individuals from their natural gene pool is a big effect that this has on the natural environment. It can cause stress on animals. It can cause disease transfer between populations, like with the fungus diseases in frogs. There's usually a massive loss of life in transport, as can be seen from like birds coming from Mexico, because there's like 3,000 to 50,000 per year that usually die in the exotic pet trade transfer. It's harder to keep tabs on just because once animals trade hands, it's hard to tell whether the animal was bred or not. And people who participate usually have little investment in the animal's well-being, as they didn't put a lot of energy into the care and raising of the animal. Now, there's several animals that have been negatively affected by the exotic pet trade. The first one we'll go over is the axolotl. Its scientific name is Ambystomata mexicanum, and it's critically endangered in the wild. Now, why it was overharvested had to do with the pet trade. It's a massively popular exotic pet currently, particularly in East Asia, and it's extremely useful in lab work as they can regenerate limbs. Because of past overharvesting, the numbers were severely reduced, and there wasn't a law in place to stop it until 2004. Even after that, cases that still locally occurred, this depleted so much that we don't even know of specific instances where it's happening anymore. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's entirely gone, and it doesn't mean that it hasn't had a huge effect on the population. And ignorance with exotic animals is still a big issue in other areas. The Burmese python, scientific name Python bivetarius, is currently threatened in its natural habitat, which is in Southeast Asia. Because of the exotic pet trade, specifically in America, these animals found their way into the Florida Everglades and have been decimating it. A lot of people started getting them, like ball pythons in the 1980s, realized they couldn't care for them once they got really big, and then started releasing them. And now, in the 2010s, we're seeing the effects with decimating wildlife populations of birds and small mammals, and these things can even eat alligators if given the opportunity, and we're having a huge trouble trying to control them. And also, it's kind of undermining the issues of the Burmese python in its own territory, as most are focusing now on the fact that it is an invasive species within the United States. Now we're going to talk about negative effects on the individual level when it comes to animals, as in animals that probably shouldn't, just in general, be kept as pets, or at least shouldn't be offered to the general populace as pets. And we'll talk about the salmon-crested cockatoo in that regard. Its scientific name is Cockatoos mollicanus. Its current status is threatened in the wild. Now, the issues with cockatoos in general is they are highly social birds that usually are in small flocks, and they need a lot of enrichment like wood and objects they can regularly destroy, regular attention from flockmates, or in this case their owner, regular schedules, room to fly around as they're usually forest-dwelling animals, and plenty of mental stimulation. But in reality, most people who buy these animals, they may get a few plastic toys and aren't allowed to chew on things around the home. Owners likely are absent most of the day, and because these animals are so expensive, very few keep more than one at a time. So they have very little social stimulation, and when their owners get home, they may not always have the time to spend with them. Schedule is usually based on the owners, which the owner has their own life, so they might be going out to eat one night, they might be going into work early, etc., etc., etc. That can stress out the bird, and they're often restricted to the cage most of the day, and as a result, they often get little mental stimulation, leading to, as you can see with this bird, pulling out feathers, severe stress, even depression, and in many cases for salmon-crested cockatoos, because of their emotional needs, they end up being rehomed repeatedly because people can't take care of them. So the issue now is, how do we solve this? And there's two main things that people tend to suggest. The first is banning, and the other one is setting up licenses. Now, I personally do not see banning as a very effective measure, but it's usually the most common done. It's easier just to ban animals outright, but this really only stops the legal trade of animals, not the illegal trade. And in that case, it almost encourages illegal sale. Because it doesn't stop people from wanting exotic pets. And it will limit how much people have access to care for their animals, as well as the knowledge on how to care for animals, as most exotic veterinary work will be limited to places of study like zoos, and it would increase the abuse of animals, either unintentionally in regards to people just not knowing how to take care of their animals, or kind of intentionally in regards to illegal traders who got no pressure to take care of their animals. Now, the one I usually suggest instead is licensing for distributors. It would help create a paper trail for these animals, encourage improved care of the animals as well before sale, and generally make people think twice before getting into breeding, because if they need a license, that's going to take a lot of time, and they'll have to get education on how to properly breed these animals. And it'll generally create a set of standards for breeders that can be regularly checked in on to make sure they're not abusing their animals. And anyone who does, and it would be really easy to catch people who are illegally trading animals, as you can basically just go up to them, check to see if they have a license or not. And if they don't have a license, then they're doing something illegal. The reason why it's important for owners to get licenses is it will help them educate them before they make purchases, as many people do not do their research before buying. It will decrease the chance of someone releasing to the wild, as all licensing procedures will require someone learn about the dangers of releasing. And it'll dissuade impulse buying of animals, which is a huge issue within just like around the holidays and stuff like that. Oftentimes people will buy pets as like gifts or something like that. Anyways, thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I hope you enjoy it.